It begins with purpose. Purpose consists of stages leading to an end. Leading to an end, goal. There are 7 stages. The stages are cumulative. That's simple enough to say, but science doesn't have any term that deals with cumulativeness, self-integration. Each stage has a power and the names of the powers are what? Potential, substance, identity, combination, growth, mobility, and dominion. I haven't left room for the levels. There is an arc. The arc goes through levels. There are 4 levels. And of course, 7 stages on the 4 levels. And we can give names to the levels. They will be the equivalent to these first 4, but in human terms, purpose, value, concept, and object. There's a fundamental asymmetry in that this side and this side are not the same. This is random, this is control. Now normally we would recognize that any qualification has its opposite, light and dark, good and bad, so on. This gets into a very deep problem of how can God create evil. So there has to be one dichotomy which is asymmetric, which can't be reversed. In other words, good and evil are not interchangeable. And this gives the concept of asymmetry, that is, there is a difference between going ahead and going back. And that's contained in this whole thing, of course, in the fact that this side is different from this side. But it's also introduced at level 2 where you get time. And time has this asymmetry. The past and the future are not the same.
Arthur, is there any at the bottom of the arc is a right angle?
Well, that arc is used primarily in theosophy, but in many occult traditions, and shown as a curve. And I borrowed from as many traditions as I could, and I stuck with a curve until I recognized that there was a discontinuity there. It wasn't just a smooth transition. There was a definite break with a change, a quantum leap, if you like. As to making it a right angle, that's up to you, but if I think of the continuation as 180 degrees because it keeps on going, then the right angle is breaking that making a distinction that wasn't before. We can get into that more later. It'll take a lot of time to explain that distinction. But a right angle, it's as though at that point you could say the moral issue of what's right comes in. Right angle. Pun intended. But you could also say it's the right answer in the sense that you're solving a problem at the fourth level. You're stuck in the mud and you can't get out, and when you get the right answer, you can get out. So it's a right angle in that sense. Yes, Peggy?
Arthur, the theory seems to divide things up. How do you reconcile, we'll say, Buddhism or mysticism or other philosophies that are striving for unity?
Oh, that's a beauty. I'm afraid I neglect all that. I went through agonies when I first got interested in Buddhism and Zen, reading these remarkable teachings, telling me about the egolessness of things and the egolessness of persons. I just couldn't understand it. What was this helicopter I was making? Did it have no selfhood? Did I have no selfhood? It was a very difficult pill to swallow. I gradually began to recognize then that the helicopter wasn't a thing. It was something you moved toward. It was a goal. Any particular model was already obsolete as soon as you'd made it. And you keep moving on, so the real thing is the dynamic that's pushing it on. And this form is something that's peeled off and thrown away when you're finished with it. So that would take care of the egolessness of things. The egolessness of persons is a subtler one, but it has to do with recognizing that the ego is not any final division. It's only a pseudo-separation. Incidentally, that's something I didn't get into yesterday when I should have. This is our torus model. You see the universe here springing from nothing. Where is it now? Where is that universe? There it comes. And it expands and expands, and if you follow it through, it gets smaller on the back. I mean, on the other side. I used that yesterday to talk about the universe expanding out, and it stays that way until you bring it back home. Tuck it all in and make it your own. In the sense you're a black hole. Well, what I didn't develop there, and as an answer to Peggy's question, is that this model provides, well, not the answer, but a way of seeing the Hindu or the Zen position, that things have no ego. Suppose I were to say I'm going to, well, this is the, excuse me, let me begin over. We have the problem of how can there be things, finite things, in an infinite universe? How can there be raisins in the cake of the continuum? How can there be separation when everything is joined together? All right, now look at this. Suppose I have a, well, here's a speck here. Let that speck be a self. I'm going to cut the self off from the rest of the universe by cutting this brown line. See, that'll separate the self from everything else. So we'll have this self with a circle around him. But the part you've cut off can still sneak up in here. the self is connected to the rest of the universe by an umbilical cord. You wouldn't see this, but it's part of the invisible that we're connected with. We are all connected with this umbilical cord to the universe and to one another. We only seem to have the separateness because of this line around ourselves. See, this doesn't altogether exist right away. These things have to develop in a cumulative fashion. And you might say we start with a point, and then we get another point. So far, we can only say we have a line. But the third, that would be the potential being the first point, substance. Then when comes the third point, you can say, but this isn't a line just going on forever. It's a circle, because 3 points determine a circle. Once you have that circle, then you say, well, that's me in the middle of that circle. But that's a pseudo-center, a pseudo-ego. The real center was here, where you started. And if you'd followed all that development, here's the rest of the universe going on over here. See, I'm drawing a cross-section of the torus. So this pseudo-center, which develops at the third stage, is the identity, and that's the ego, and it's correct to say that things are egoless, and this identity is a pseudo-identity. But if you're going to say that there is no ego, you also have to say there's no combination, there's no growth, there's no mobility. All of these things are pseudo developments from the ultimate principle that's up here.
You draw on geometry very heavily. One of your books is Geometry of Meaning. Why do you use that as the basis of your theory? For example, why not an algebra of meaning, or is the geometry more basic than, say, topology? And is mathematics really the basic thing?
Well, I'd certainly have to take time to think about that. The geometry is lends itself to visual representation. And it's true up to a point. Well, maybe I don't want to say point there. I have to be careful. It's true in a superficial way, with not intending to make a pejorative statement there. I don't mean a put down by superficial. I mean dealing with surfaces. And surface is the way the mind has to deal with things. It's two-dimensional. You make plans, you read books. These are all things that are on surfaces, and they differ from the actual participation in experience, which involves a different dimension of going in. So insofar as you're dealing with the surfaces of things or the analysis of things, the geometry is adequate. If you want to get beyond that, you get into the topology where the mice come creeping out of the floor. I mean, things come from unexpected quarters. You can't just lay it all flat. You have these, i.e. wormholes, what are they, that are connecting everything with everything else, and you can't use logic. But the logic is a good tool, and the geometry is a good tool. I haven't brought this out in seminars. Let you in on a secret. When I went to this school for self-development way back in '49, one of the lessons was to write prayers. This went very, very hard for me because I thought you shouldn't ask for anything. But I found this exercise very beneficial because you write a prayer and you find out, well, you really didn't want that. And you keep on pulling layers of yourself off to find what you really want, and it becomes very, very embarrassing and at the same time rewarding. Well, I was doing this consciously. It affected my sleep state. In the sleep state, I came to the point. I went right ahead and said I wanted to know the secrets of the universe. 2 nights later, I had another dream which gave me the secrets of the universe. I think I won't go into it, but it was the dream that led to the geometry of meaning. And 3 nights later, I had another dream, and it it's embarrassing to put this down. There were these 4 steps, and there was a man made out of sheet metal. I'm not very good artist, but he was sliding down these steps, and as he slid down, his head hit here and was bent at a right angle.
That's wonderful.
And when my teacher, to whom I had to report these dreams, she said, yes, that's the algebra of evolution. Well, it wasn't until 7 years later that I started to write the book, The Reflexive Universe. But well, it's just so wonderful. I can't talk about it. These things are going on inside us. They're going on all around us. And our little egos are talking about science and things. We don't really know what's going on.
A few minutes ago you were saying that the arc was found in a lot of different traditions that you had looked at. And I was wondering if you've done any correspondence between the 4 levels and the 7 stages, if you've correlated that with some of the other esoteric traditions or systems.
Well, I tried to. I tried to use everything I could find. But as I did so, the thing came into a definite shape, for instance, 7. And I can't say now that it's consistent with all of them because they're not consistent with each other. As Sidney Hook said, how can they agree with me if I don't agree with them? The difficulty is that we don't really know which are the authentic traditions. Everybody has his own view, you see. Now, to a remarkable extent, they are the same, for instance, in 7ness. But when you get, for instance, into Steiner, he has the 7ness beginning with base matter and 7 different bodies climbing up from the base matter. I can't accept that because the base matter wasn't there in the first place. You see, we have to explain how that base matter came about, and that uses up 3 or 4 of them. So what I suspect is that Steiner starts here, that's fine, and goes up, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he picks up what I would call the substages of the arc within this stage and gets the 5, 6, 7 there. But I don't want to, sort of dress somebody else's baby. That's their problem. I would say this is the supreme orthodoxy. It's the beginning. There's so many things that are, in this sense, orthodox. I didn't mention the emerald tablet yesterday. Emerald Tablet is 3000 BC, one of the first descriptions of any kind of the descent of first principles. And it says that the soul, no, the first descent of the monad into experience is as the point into the line. Now, unfortunately, I haven't developed that side of it, but I did mention yesterday that the point is the beginning and then it gets expanded into time. The point into the line is the spirit, which is timeless, going into the soul, which is in time and experiences things in time. The emergent paradigm is it's something like the epiphenomena thing, saying consciousness is an epiphenomena. You put all these molecules and stuff together, and there's some kind of steam comes out of it, or some vapor, and that's consciousness. Something emerges from all the molecules that you couldn't explain. Now, in other words, it's a consequence of the molecular activity, but it wasn't there in the first place. Whereas I would insist that the consciousness is there in the first place, and the molecules are a later development, or the atoms actually, and then the molecules. But in physics, there isn't any way. You can't just ignore this uncertainty that creeps in with Heisenberg and is even more prominent for the photon. I wrote to Heisenberg about that, and he copped out on me. He said, well, maybe that was Papa, but he himself, he had to remain a physicist and stick to the statistics. See, what I'd asked him was, could I extend his principle of uncertainty that he'd applied to the electron? You try to see the electron, and in order to see it, you move it so that your information isn't valid. I said, well, what about the photon? If you were to see a photon, you have to eliminate it. And then you can't predict anything about it at all. So there's no... See, the electron, it's something like 1% uncertainty. But with the photon, it's 100%.
Wouldn't the implications of Heisenberg and Gödel and company be that you can have no system, no rational system, which could describe the nature of things with any certainty? And is the very attempt to create such a system therefore not bound to fail?
I buy everything you said except the last. The attempt may expand the borders, but you'll never get to the end. I mean, the uncertainty is going to be there, whatever. And I'm only disappointed that the Gödel, you see, proved that you could logically show that there were propositions in logic that couldn't be proved, or that logic was incomplete. Now, I think that was a great start, but they haven't done much about it. They just display it as a sort of Baedeker 4-star item. You must stop and look at this monument that Gödel has created. Because it can become the basis of something like this, in where you recognize the uncertainty as the generating principle. And in a sense, this is a rationalism, but it's not a rationalism that denies the existence of the uncertainty. It's one that accepts it.
How do you explain precognitive dreams if the future is undetermined?
Well, I didn't say the future was undetermined. You can create the future to some extent. Remember, I think it was Mark Edmund Jones said that the future is determined. It's the past that's not determined. What he meant by that was that you could go back and rethink the past and see it in totally different terms from what you had seen it, so that you can change the past, make it more meaningful, and hence, but the future you can't deal with. Now, the precognitive dreams, in a sense, I don't explain it. It's not going to be like an X-ray vision or something that you just crank the wheels and there you see the future. Look at any of those things that do predict the future, like Nostradamus, the vague terms. He was picking up something, but it's up to you to translate it. When exactly is this California going to slide into the sea and so forth? To apply to logic, what are the four? Well, one axis would be true and false. Say true here. And then, well, what's the positive side of false? See, I can't just bias it all in favor of truth. What's the positive for false? Well, you feel like thinking about it, or shall I? Where would it be? Well, maybe it's not an easy question. Fiction. Imagination, see, making it up. And if you were writing a novel, the positive thing would be to be able to create a fiction, a new situation. It wouldn't be based on a true account of the facts of your life. So now if this axis is consistent versus inconsistent, then I would have to find what's the positive. What's the positive of inconsistent?
A joke.
Variation.
Jump? What was it?
Variation.
Variation.
A joke.
Well, variation is good and jump is good.
No, a joke. A joke.
Joke.
A joke with consistency isn't much of a joke, unless there's something
Right.
absurd about it.
Right. Well, it's not the one I want there. The way I struggled with this for weeks, so I went back and forth to Princeton thinking about it. So I had to ask myself, what is consistent? What does the thing have to be consistent? It has to proceed from what was there before. So you have a lot of proposition. A consistent one follows from what was there before. So what's inconsistent doesn't follow from what was there before. So if it doesn't follow from what was there before, it's novel. That was somewhat contained in Jack's answer, but this brings it more. And I could go from that to a first cause. It's because the scientist is being logical and using consistency as his criterion that he refuses to accept any first cause. The uncertainty would be the first cause. Something suddenly comes into existence that wasn't there before. It's not in the rules. The patent office makes that the criterion for a patent. The patent has to be something that could not be thought of by one skilled in the art. Otherwise, it's not novel. In other words, something not consistent with what's gone before. So you can see there's a positive side to each of these four things. In order to emphasize these differences, it makes it seem as though I've separated the world into pieces. But I'm really, you see what I'm talking about are, in a sense, the roots. the word roots, the roots belong to the tree. You couldn't just pick up the root and carry it off and think you had something. It's because it's part of the tree that it's both a root and part of the whole, both a part and a whole.
Refer to ESP as something characteristic of primitive man who was less individual and more a member of his tribe. Many people see ESP as something we're evolving toward. Is there a difference between these two types of ESP?
Well, let me first say that the ESP on level 2 is there in the first place, and that we have to learn how to do without it. It's sort of look, ma, no hands. I'm learning this thing by science instead of by my inherent abilities. Otherwise, how could we take time to be serious about science? We've got to give up those ESP things to get the full benefit out of this muck down here. I mean, this stuff you play with. Then we can get it back as we ascend again. I'm very fond of these fourness examples. And this one is based on how a TV works. The TV is sent to you by what's called the carrier. It's electromagnetic wavelength of, what, I don't know, about 1 meter or 300, roughly 300 That's the number of meters that a light travels. And 1 meter divided into that means it's 300,000 vibrations, 300 million vibrations per second. And that's coming, it's generally represented as a wave, an undulating wave. But 300 million per second, and that carries the signal. That in turn is modulated by amplitude. It could be different ways, but in other words, there's a modulating frequency superimposed on that that changes the amplitude. It doesn't change the frequency. There's still that many of them, but some of them are big and some of them are little. And that makes the equivalent of dots, bright or dark. Every now, some of the dots are bright and some of them are dark. They're almost like a digital signal, on, off, but it's a modulation of the carrier. In other words, the signal's changing very rapidly. That rapid change is then, on that is superimposed another frequency which breaks the line up into pieces and distributes them on a screen. So you'd have a row of dots and then another row of dots and another and another and another and another and another, till you had about 400 rows of dots. And some of these dots are bright and some of them are not bright, so that you would get a distribution of dots. It made a face, say, or whatever the image was. That you would see that because of the persistence of vision, the dots last long enough for you to see them as a face, or as persons walking, or fish, or birds. And then that whole frame is done over again and over again, 30 times a second, and you see a moving picture. Now, you see, this carrier is electromagnetic waves, so it's like the photons. It's the same nature. It is photons, but very low frequency. So it's level 1. And this alternation of on-off, change of amplitude, change of value, is level 2. Now, of course, 3 is a two-dimensional screen, so it's level 3. So this was a one-dimensional array like time. This is a two-dimensional presentation in simultaneity of relationship. That's what 3 always is. It's the presentation in simultaneity of relationship. And 4 is a combination of time and 2 dimensions, and you get the moving picture. The picture isn't just static, it changes. I'd like to show you another interesting fourness. It's rather one of the stranger ones. It begins with the question of making a map on a map. I don't know whether you've heard about this as a paradox. It's a famous paradox. Bertrand Russell talked about it. You start out making a map of England or a map of London on one city block of London. Well, you've got everything on this map, but until you come to the block itself, then you have to have on the map a picture of the block that you're making the map on, so that everything on the map has to be done over again and much smaller. Or you could think of the girl on the cracker box, but maybe the map, let's say that's England, and this is, or London, and this is the block that you're making the map on, and there's some features here. Well, those must be there. But when you get to making the block, then you have to have a little block, and then in that block you have a still littler block, and this goes on and on forever, and it's supposed to be an eternal regression, a paradox, and so forth. And I thought about it a lot, and what I came up with was that there's a difference in time. You see, you say here is London, and that's the way things are. And then you start to make a map of that. Well, you're beginning to put new stuff in, so it's in different time, and essentially that new map is displaced from this. You could think of it as lifted off, but you'll see why I've moved it up. In other words, it's not on the same plane. It's in a different time. And the next one would be the map of the map would be displaced again. And if you think of this as an eternal regression, you'd get a whole sequence of these things going on and on and on. I haven't done this very well, but you can see that there'd be a long string of them. Now, then if you look at that string and see, well, what is it that distinguishes the different ones, you would have to admit that they get finer and finer. The texture gets finer, because in order to map the map, you have to have a finer texture. You can carry that back and map the whole thing with a finer texture, but in any case, you're using a finer texture as you move along this sequence. Now, there's going to be a limit to the fineness of the texture. In the case of this TV that we're taking now, the resolution power of the TV will come to an end somewhere. The human eye also has a resolving power, and the limit of that is better than the TV. I think it's something like 10 times better than the TV. But it's still a limit. That means Not that these squares get smaller and smaller and smaller, necessarily, but that this whole thing gets as large as it can be for you to look at. And the largest it can be is to fill a whole circle. It can't be more than a circle. So that if I were really to draw these things correctly, I would draw them the other way around. That is, this is fairly small, and this gets larger, and the next one larger, until finally you fill the whole field of view with the map. It's as big as you can go with the map. That would be the ultimate map that completely filled the field of view and exhausted the resolving power. Well, if that case, then you could talk about something at the center, which would be the eye, which would be looking at this map. Get the map mixed up with the eye. But the eye is at the center looking at all these maps. And the maps don't go on forever. They go to the eye. So the point ends the sequence. So what happened? We started out, we made a map. That was a two-dimensional display. Then we made another map, and another map, and another map, and another map. Well, thinking of all those maps together, we got a one-dimensional array of maps. And that led to the final end of the eye, so that the sequence becomes two-dimensional map, one-dimensional array, improving in value, finally to the point that's looking at it. Now that's almost like our four types, or four levels. Where's the fourth level? You see, the physical object. Well, that's London or England that you started with. You began by making a map of London. We're out in Wonderland and we can take all sorts of side trips, and I don't know when to stop. See, if we ask ourselves, what are the resolution of the mind based on, then it takes me right into the geometry of meaning. And you can divide things four ways, shall we say. But then, after you get tired of doing that, you can recognize that you can divide things three ways. And that compounds. So you get 4 ways and 3 ways, which is 12 ways, and that's the basis of the measure formula in physics, and incidentally of astrology. And then you can say, well, that isn't enough. Let's divide in 5 ways and 6 ways. And you get 360 degrees then, because 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 is 360. And that was the Babylonian basis for the choice of sexagesimal system, the system based 360 degrees. Now, if you think of the circle as being the whole, and these divisions of the circle as being distinctions that you're able to make about the whole, then you've actually exhausted the power of the mind at that point, because you can't divide further by rational methods. That doesn't mean you can't have more than 360 distinctions, because any one of these things can multiply by itself. I mean, you can make the binary distinction go as far as you like. But there are different kinds of distinctions made by 3-ness versus 4-ness versus 5-ness and so on. But the kinds of distinctions become exhausted at 7, or before you get to 7. That's pretty far out, and I don't purport to prove it now. I'm just indicating one of these bipeds. I'm always interested in 7s, and there's the most obvious 7, which, if you'll trust me, I'll try to do it. If I make circles, and I didn't come out right, but if I make 6 circles, they will exactly create a 7th at the center. Or alternatively, had I made the one at the center and made 6 around, they would exactly fill up the space. But I wanted to see if I could do it wrong end too, because there's something in saying that if you make 6, you get the 7th gratis. It's like on the 7th day God rested. The 7th comes out of what has been done. There's no further physical addition needed. It is a very important addition, but it's not tangible or physical. That's what I was trying to illustrate there, yes?
I just thought that in connection with that, the 7th tone in music is also called the leading tone.
Oh.
And it's one that's implied by the tones that have gone before it, and it contains the character of the tone that is going to be the octave or the 8th.
This is a very subtle thing. I'm just beginning to get a nose for it now. There's a wonderful alchemical story. It's called The Chemical Wedding. And it begins with this scholar who's studying in his house, and this angel comes with wings with the eyes of peacocks all over them, and hands him an engraved invitation to a wedding. And he goes to the wedding. The wedding turns out to be an initiation procedure that takes place in 7 towers, and each tower has 7 stories, and the initiates, as they graduate from each rite or each test, move to a higher story. And some of them don't pass, and they're taken out. And our hero, by the dint of great effort, gets to the 6th stage, and then someone comes and taps him on the shoulder and says he's finished now. So he's very crestfallen because he failed at the last point. They take him up to the 7th story, and he's allowed to look through a hole and see the other ones struggling with their 6th initiation. But the last one is gratis to see. It's that extra thing. He didn't even know he was going to get it. Well, I'd always resisted the temptation to use this as a case of 7. It was too sort of simplistic, the 7 circles. Well, it was simplistic because it only could be done on a surface. It wasn't true in a volume or higher dimensional volumes. You see, in a volume, I think it's 12 around 1, 12 spheres around 1. And in higher dimensions, it's a great deal more, so there was no particular significance about this. Well, then I realized that this is significant, even though it's a surface, because all analysis is a surface. So we look at the world as 7-fold because it's an analytical view. I'm afraid that's all you can do. You can't have analysis in anything other than a superficial way. In other words, if you were to go into it further, you would go into it by participating in it. You'd jump in the water and start swimming instead of looking at it. And that's what the higher stages of evolution do. After you're finished with the mind, it literally means that. You throw it away. You proceed from an inner source. And the mystery of that eludes me, and I don't think it could ever be transmitted. Something you'd have to gain yourself. Number 1 is a point. We can say 2 is like a line, but another way to say is give it 2 points, because 2 points determine a line. You can also think of the binary thing, 2, binary. But the line really involves a 3-ness, so that's a little dangerous, because the line is not only the 2 points, but something in between. And in fact, it's that force between the 2 elements, the 2 particles, the Adam and Eve, that force is the important thing. Well, then the third, we can say that's 3 points. Before we said a plane, you see, but a plane is determined by 3 points. That's the rule for a plane. That leads then to 4 points for 4. Now, if I join the 3 points, I get a triangle, which is a plane figure to be sure. But what happens when I join the 4 points? Now, of course, I've joined 4 points, that's a square, but that's not a complete joining. I'd have to join those 2 points, that's all right. But I can't join those 2 without crossing over. It's as though, see, I have 4 points here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I can make a diagonal here. That diagonal would, if I made the rule that they have to be the same length, it makes it happen. The rectangle, if joined by an equal line, then it has to stretch out into a diamond. Now 2 equilateral triangles. But to join this and this, I'd have to bend the thing up a little bit. Then hinge these up to make this line equal to that line. So I get into a tetrahedron. Think of that as a pyramid. Now, can you see it as a pyramid? See, I'm representing it in 2 dimensions, but that's a pyramid, and the hidden edge is dotted behind. So I've got from point, line, plane, solid. Can we do that more? Can we go up the other side with that same thing? This will take us into the question of higher dimensions, because we've gone from here's no dimension, 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimensions. So this would be 4 dimensions. I can proceed with this program, which has gone 1, 2, 3, 4, by taking 5 points, joining those. Now it looks like a pentagon, okay? But then you start joining these things, you get in trouble, because you can't join them all without crossing. The other rule, can't have equal lengths. If I try to have equal lengths, I'll get this, 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 this. That's same as this. And then put another one, put another point, and I'll have 2. Everything's all right so far. I haven't stretched any of the lines because I've just taken 2 of these and put them base to base. But when I get into trouble when I join those 2, because that one has to be longer. Now this is very interesting because it introduces the 5th dimension or 4th dimension, and it tells us what it is. I hope I'm not losing you now. This is sort of abstract, but it's really fun. What do you think it is? What happens to that line in there?
It doubles its size. Doubles its size?
Yes,
Times
but
space?
how can it double its size if it's the same length? You have to stretch it. Do you see what I mean? The line, in order to get in there is to be stretched. Now, if you were an engineer making something, this would be a no-no. You must not make that kind of structure. It's what's called redundant. It means that the structure is straining against itself because there are two things determining the length. I mean, the thing has its own length and then to be longer. So there's an internal stress in this thing, and it can be so great as to have the thing break even though nobody's putting any load on it. This wouldn't do with a bridge, for instance. Bridge is supposed to carry the load. But if the bridge breaks of its own internal nervous tension, it wouldn't be much as a bridge. But we're beginning to get something about life there, because life has this internal strength. You could look at a seed, and it wouldn't look any different from a rock, say. Maybe it's a different color or something. But the seed has this internal stress in it that when released gives it a chance to grow into a tree, shall we say. This, of course, would apply to other forms of internal stress, but it's the internal stress that is the livingness. It's sort of canned livingness that's ready to spring into action at the appropriate time.
So are you saying that life itself is the fourth dimension in this sense?
I'm saying that we're beginning to get a clue to life because this dimension of internal stress, which is stored energy, i.e. negative entropy, is what characterizes the plant kingdom here, which stores energy. It doesn't suffice to tell us what's going on in the next one, but we're on our way. Now, I don't know too much about the next one, so I won't wear you out telling you about it. It happens when you make 4. And that I indicate by these lines. There are 3 diagonals now that are stressed. And I think it has to do with 3-way stretch of animals in order to move, but I can't prove that. And the 7th introduces a final point. One way to put it is to just put another point in there and put lines to it. And I don't know what it is. It could be the central nervous system or something. It's that extra thing relating everything else. This whole question of dimension as a sort of, everybody are always saying, well, let's get into the 5th dimension and escape to some other planet or something. But the 5th dimension, well, let's go back to the 3rd dimension. It was these 3 dimensions that confine us where we are. If we didn't have these dimensions, we'd be freer. So we don't want any more dimensions. That's the wrong direction. So what I'm really saying is that the external dimensions are, repertoire is fulfilled when you get to the 3 dimensions of space and time. And the next step is to go back, which is to say inward, and use these dimensions in a different way. Now the same, if you want to be technical, the same thing is borne out by the formula for interval. I've been spanked so many times for putting the mathematics in, I don't want to do it. But the formula for interval, this is the Einstein difference between 2 events, is x squared plus y squared plus z squared minus dt squared, minus the time. The time has a negative coefficient. And if you want to go further, you have to have more negative coefficients. You can't have more positive coefficients. The negative coefficients, since there's minus dt squared, so that's a negative sign in front of a square, so when you carry out the square root, you get an imaginary coefficient. The time is imaginary. That's why we can't measure it the way we do space. I mean, we go around with rulers measuring space, and so on. We don't do that with time. We have to wait for it to pass. And then we can't get back again. So it's essentially different. See, I can spin out these fantasies, and you can bear with me or you can not. I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's sort of technical discussion. But what I want to be sure to bring out is the inherently different nature of these levels. And I have to refer to gut-type things because as soon as you get off the intellectual map, you're into another area. You're in what could be called the water principle or the fire principle. Now we come, I've let it out, but these principles by the ancients were described as fire, water, air, and earth. Different aspects of existence. Why aspects? Because they were the gods of the different directions. And you could call it dimensions, but it's better to stick to the word aspects. The faces of God. Remember the lion and the eagle and the man and the bull were in Christian tradition. They are the animals of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. But they're also the gods of the four directions, and there are the four elements. But it's been very valuable to me because of the feeling content that's there. It's not just an algebraic expression like X, Y, Z, and T. Water is watery. Air is like the space around something. It gives the shape. Earth is solid. It's like objects. And fire is the spiritual bursting out thing. Now the fourness comes about because I'm looking and the object is there. The object is objective and I'm projecting and looking at it. And I can talk about my sensations that I would receive from the object as whether it's rough or smooth or something like that. And the other projections that I make on the object, that it's beautiful or it's ugly or I like it or I don't like it. The values I place on it are projections from me. But what I want to guard against is if you look at this as a mapping, such as from over there, you say, okay, well, you're this object looking at that object. I've had several people write to me and tell me how to do this. So I get systems theory to deal with the relationship between those two things. That is not what I want to do. Because when I move over here to look at it, I'm staying with me. I never can move over and look at myself. No matter how quick I go, I can't see myself. And that I that's looking cannot be an object. And that's the nature of the photon. Remember, it can't be an object because as soon as you see it, it's done for. I noticed when I was halfway into the book that these stages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, didn't fit together end to end as a chain. What called my attention to it was that the animals, instead of taking off at the end of the vegetable kingdom, begin all over again by unicellular creatures. And this was very disconcerting to me. I couldn't figure out there's no chain here. Well, then I noticed that this was true of all the even kingdoms. They begin over again. The odd ones take a step forward, and then the even ones recapitulate that step before the next odd one takes another forward step. In that respect, it's like music. A theme is repeated before it moves on to new material. Now, I hadn't intended to put them in any order. You thought of DNA last, so it It's the last on the ring. But irrespective of this order, how would you place them in the order of their complexity?
DNA the most complex.
DNA is the most.
And proteins?
Proteins next.
Would benzene come next?
Benzene, not there.
Wood?
Plastic.
Plastics, which I'll give the chemical name is polymers. Now I can get rid of those three. And H2O and NaCl are really the same. So now I only got three. Oh, we've left one out. But it doesn't matter because when I have the gap, then I can fish around and find out what it is. I'm going to put,
So
The blackboard.
the methane series.
huh?
What's the blackboard made out of?
The backbone.
The blackboard.
Oh, the blackboard. Yes, right. Right. Well, what shall I call them? Minerals, but there's other things that are going to go there too. I want to put number one in to get ourselves started, and the simplest is obviously metals. Why? Because metals are just unitary. There's all the same stuff. I mean, it's all copper, it's all nickel. They are different from the atoms, because atomic iron would be single atoms, and you don't get the properties, what are called molar properties, as say hardness, strength, conductivity, density, malleability. These properties cannot emerge with single atoms. You couldn't have a single atom that had density, for instance. I remember saying this at a seminar, and I happened to be looking at the girl, but she was pregnant, so it wasn't correct to say you couldn't have density for one thing. There's already a population density in this person. But aside from jokes, metals are one atom. And then comes NaCl, salts, acids, bases, two atoms. And the methane series, somebody said benzene, but it's part of the methane series. Now, we've got this, except that minerals does not fully cover this. It's practically all organic molecules that are not polymers. So I'll just say organic. Now we've got enough to play with here. The thing is to find the properties that describe the stages or the substages and how they apply to these chemicals. This is the game that I started playing with myself when I first did this crossword puzzle. See, I had a gap for something. There had to be a chemical that would grow. Well, I knew that DNA could duplicate itself, but that would be too complicated. I didn't realize until someone told me. I met this gentleman at a research conference. I was just then working on the book, and I was teaching myself about chemistry. I'd had some chemistry in college, but it didn't go beyond this stage of salts. And I said, is there a chemical that grows? And he said, yes, polymers. Now, the polymers literally do that. They're long chains of units. And there may be 100,000, 200,000 units long. See, we're talking about wood with cellulose, rubber, all plastics, rayon, nylon, all of these synthetic plastics, but all of the things that vegetables make, rubber for instance. They're long chains of molecules, which I could represent this way as because each subunit may have 15 or 20 atoms in it, but the units are like links in a chain. Now, I was then still looking for something that moved, and I didn't get my nerve up till after the coffee to ask him, well, was there a chemical that moved? This seemed such a ridiculous thing I didn't want to ask him. But I finally got up my courage and asked. He said, yes, St. Georgie has just discovered that actin and myosin, which are the chemicals that make up the muscle, actually themselves move. And those are proteins, and it's generally characteristic of the proteins. They have this mobility nature. The only criticism I got of my book was by a local biologist who said I didn't mention that chemicals could move. Well, I was able to say, well, he hadn't read the book because I had 3 or 4 pages about this substage of chemicals that move. Remember, motion was the character of the animal mobility stage, and growth was the characteristic of the 5th picture of a salt. I should keep this going forever. I haven't got it all. What I'm trying to illustrate by this is that every salt, every atom in the salt is surrounded by neighbors, and the neighbors are of the opposite sex, so to speak. I'm here, there's a girl here, and a girl here, and a girl there, and a girl there, and a girl there. Now, which is my partner? See, the molecule is a partnership of 2. You can't say which is the partnership because it can be read 6 different ways. It's a community of business, and it's held by this attraction, sort of, which I would say is analogous to sexual attraction. It's plus and minus. The methane series makes a big jump from that, and they get off by themselves with a business of electrons going round and round. That's the simplest methane molecule. It's held together by a different kind of bond. It's not the sexual attraction bond. It's a contract that they're going to share these electrons. They are isolated. They float around. That's why the methane series, it's named after the gas methane, and propane is another, ethane is another. Most of the members of that series are gaseous. That is to say, the molecules are flying around by themselves. They're not locked together in the embrace that the salt is into. So we've got this community bond here and a different kind of bond here, which makes for separation. It's called a covalent bond. I want to keep it in mind, but it's too complicated. It goes from simple to compound, from non-functional to functional. There's already a beginning of this 1-1-2 because we repeat this in the second. That is to say, the repetition is the compounding. Here the repetition is from non to functional. In the next one, this is going to be they're called non-functional polymers. I'll just say non-F polys. And these become functional polymers. Now, I don't want to just confuse you with titles, but I'm concentrating on the name because that's a clue to what's going on. You go from non-functional to function, from non-function to function. That's twice, so you've repeated that 1-1-2 thing. To show you now what this symmetry is, because we've got an arc, but an arc of molecules. What's common to these two, the methane series, is the covalent bond. This points to here, by the way. It's the polymers that are the non-functional. So that matches this non-functional. They're both non-functional. And it's because of this covalent bond, this bond that's like a marriage contract. Whereas here was where my theory was predicting. And I didn't know that much about chemistry until I read carefully. The ionic bond which holds the salts together comes in again here. And the interesting thing is, in the case, here are these two chemicals, actin and myosin. And it's almost like a firecracker or a bomb. It's ready to go off. But the ionic bond is used to prevent them from discharging, whereas the ionic bond here holds them locked. It's the use of the ionic bond here, whereas this one is used by the ionic bond. It's similar here. The covalent bond here keeps them out of circulation. The covalent bond here makes it possible for this chain to stay chained together and not fall apart when it goes into chemical solution. DNA, of course, is mind-boggling because it contains within its own structure, which is billions of atoms in a long chain with all this information coded. You read about that, so I won't go into it. Not only does itself include billions of atoms, but it makes organisms billions and billions of times larger than itself. Now, you see there's a sweep there from one atom per molecule, two, many, and back up to a unitary principle. There's only one kind of DNA, different kind of information in it. But it's one shape, the spiral helix. It's like these are all the tools that man uses, hammers and chisels and saws and so forth. These are books. You could say books are all the same shape. They don't depend on their shape. They depend on the content. The DNA, it's the content that counts. Whereas here, it's the shape that counts. And this is analogous to the shape, many kinds of shape of animals. This is analogous to the single shape of man. It's very clear that the DNA rungs, you see it's a long twisted chain, but there are rungs on this ladder. And each rung contains 7 units. I just refer you to the books there. You find that the phosphates are on the end, and then the pentose sugars next to the end, and then the 3 things that combine. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7. The guanine and I can't remember their names in the middle make up the 3 with the 2 at each end, so it's 7. Those 2 and then the 3 in the middle. And the proteins are very clearly 6-fold because you count the number of bonds in the peptide link. You found there are 6. The polymers are quite clearly 5-fold because I mentioned there were 15 or 20. Well, it generally is it's a multiple of 5 atoms in a unit. And I think this is part of their capacity to store energy. Remember I said 5 was associated with energy storage and self-reproduction. When you join up all the diagonals of the star, you get another star. This principle of self-generation and strain is built into 5. And so if you have 5 atoms forming a unit, or 5, there can be 15 or there can be 20, but there are 5, it's multiple of 5. I strongly suspect that the stress is in the interrelationships between those atoms, because the polymers are storing energy, hence they're under stress. Wood, you're releasing the energy that is stored in those bonds. When you eat the sugar, you draw on, or starch, you're drawing on that energy. So I haven't done it for 4, but the others seem to be clearly numerological in their nature. However, it would be better to come up with something very hard-nosed before you stuck your neck out on that thesis. I said earlier that man as a whole is at the stage, man in his kingdom corresponds to the clam in the animal kingdom. He's just beginning to know how to move into, I don't know whether you saw that picture of the clam the other day. It was quite interesting. I didn't think clams could move around, but they open and shut their shells very rapidly, and they actually kind of swim. Some sort of jet propulsion they do. So maybe man isn't so bad after all, because as he is making jet propulsion, but intellectually, spiritually, he's still a clam. You know, Jung wanted everyone to develop their intuition, their intellect, their sensation, emotion evenly, or at least if there's one pushed down, that should be brought up. And that's probably very true therapeutically, but it implies that you're supposed to develop them all at once. And according to Brunner, you develop them one at a time. You first develop the sensation to its full development, and then take the intuitive feeling type, and then the logic. And in order to do the logic, you have to repress the intuitive feeling, because you can't do both at once. As though you want to exercise the left arm, so you put your other arm in a sling. And now coming to how does the intellect get through its own mess, in the Chinese proverb they say the mind is slayer of the real. Then they add, only the mind can slay the slayer. They have to work their own way out of it. And you find that people at the end of the ego range are doing these intellectual paradoxes for themselves. They're talking about Zen. They're interested in Zen. They're interested in unintellectualizing themselves with the intellect. There's a wonderful parable or story in Greek about slaying the Medusa. What is the Medusa? See, it's the head with all these snakes coming out. It's the power of intellect. And another thing, it turns things to stone. That's what intellect does. It concretizes everything, makes it specific, rigid structure. Well, how do you deal with the Medusa? That's the cute part. Remember what he did?
You look at it through a mirror.
Right. He had this shield which he could look at the Medusa in the reflection. Now, the mirror is a symbol for the mind. So, only the mind can slay the mind. Only the mind can slay the slayer. It's partly the reason I'm being so intellectual, because I'm hoping to answer the scientists in their own terms, rather than say, well, you should use your intuition. I say, go ahead and use your intellect, and you'll find you'll find the way through, you'll find this answer. Now, what's the difference between these two objets? Of course, they're different shapes, but the point about it is that what's involved here is one circulation. What's involved here are two, because there's one that goes around this way and one that goes around this way. Now if this had a zero hole, I think you can see that the radius of this circle going around would be the same as this circle. In other words, the formula then becomes pi squared r cubed. Now, if mathematics bothers you, just think, I'm only asking you to think of the fact that pi is squared there. In other words, you have 2 pi's, whereas this you only have 1, or 4/3 pi r cubed, but it's just 1 pi. That means there's only one circulation in the sphere, and there are 2 circulations here. Now this other circulation is what makes it possible to have mapping of 7 colors. But it's also turns the thing upon itself and makes this possible, this V, this turn of the V. Started with a point which has 0 dimension, and then we go down to 1 chalk problem again. 1, and then 2 dimensions, all represented by plane, and then 3. One, 2, or 0, 1, 2, and 3 dimensions. So that this 0 dimensionality, which is the freedom to rotate around in different directions, is revived here and changes the sphere into the more complicated structure of the donut. It changes to this. Now, what's been happening is wasting away of energy. At this point, the molecule is able to store energy. Well, how does it do it? It does it by timing. It's like a jiu-jitsu wrestler who's dealing with a bigger opponent, but is able to overcome or let the opponent overcome himself by correct use of timing. He steps out of the way when the big one makes a lunge and the big one falls on his face. In any case, he gathers energy by correct use of timing. And that timing, then, where did it come from? How did it have the capacity to time it? Because it was way back here at the start. So in a sense, this turn is a rebirth of what the spiritual principle that was up here. And in myth, it's referred to as the virgin birth. It means a birth that doesn't have a cause. Can you see the connection there, the logic of that? Because it's a symbol, you see. I always thought the virgin birth meant some kind of purity. But in the Egyptian symbol for the soul, the rebirth symbol in Egypt is the scarab beetle, because the scarab lays its egg in dung, and out of the dung is born the new beetle. Now that's hardly an illustration of purity, but it is an illustration of something coming out of nothing, of spirit coming out of decayed matter. So what's really essential here is not so much the purity of the virgin as the fact that a virgin birth is a birth without a cause, a birth without a father. In short, it's first cause. Remember, I tried to establish first cause, the logical requirement of it, as the opposite of consistency, in that the proposition that didn't have any antecedents would be a novel proposition. Well, a birth that didn't have any father would be a birth without any antecedents. And that comes out of this extra rotation, because it's a freedom to turn. One time I was going to call the book, I've forgotten what I was going to do, but the subtitle was The key that locks the prison unlocks it, but you have to turn it the other way. Now it's turning it the other way that's this turning to which I referred. It's turning time the other way. It's inverting cause and effect in the sense that any thinking process that says, well, how did this happen? It has to use the principle of inference. Inference, well, if this happens, then this will happen. That thinking takes place in an inverted time sense. Let me see if I can show how that is. Suppose I say that if you build a fire, you get smoke. So the fire is the cause of the smoke. On the other hand, I could say where there's smoke, there's fire. In other words, if you see smoke, you can infer that there was a fire there to make it. You're beginning with number 2 and inferring number 1. So you're going back in your inverted time. So if I learn that A is the cause of B, then I can, wanting B, I can make A happen, so I'll get B. So it becomes, in brief, B, A, B. Suppose it was the fire causes cooking. Well, I think of how good it would be to have this nice cooked steak, so I make the fire in order to get the cooked steak. I've inverted the order. That inversion, turning around time, couldn't happen in the physical world. It has to happen in the mind. It's imaginary.
Is there a way to explain in an individual's life what it looks like when they're at the turn?
Well, for one thing, it's the aha experience. You see, they're doing something, they're beating their head against the stone wall, and then they wake up and realize that they're doing it to themselves, or something like that. I suppose the point is it's very hard to get the person to see. I mean, you could tell them something, but it wouldn't be effective. That's why it has to be a virgin birth. It has to be their own doing. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't make people good by telling them to be good. They have to be good of their own volition. And likewise, in this health situation, if they're doing something that's against their own interests, they have to be the ones to do it. I remember seeing, I think it was a case where wet his bed or something. They couldn't get him over this. And the analyst said, well, I want you to pee in your pants for me right now. And I don't know whether he succeeded or not, but the reversal of effort was enough to clear him of the compulsion that he'd been under before, and he no longer had the trouble. Now, I'm not saying this is a solution, but I'm saying it's sort of the way, if you were trying to find a formula for it, you'd get the person to reverse the polarity. See, and they're hung up this when they're trying something very hard, and the harder they pull, the more hooked it is. Get them to pull the other way so it can get unhooked. But eventually, it's up to them. I mean, you might prepare the ground for it and make it more possible, but they would have to do it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the virgin birth. I remember reading Joseph Campbell. He seems to be determined to show that myths are derived from one another. I mean, he'll trace a certain story like Moses getting lost in the bulrushes and find that it occurred in other myths. I don't know what he'd do with the virgin birth, but I would insist that the virgin birth myth is not imported from somewhere else. It arises spontaneously in all cultures because it's talking about the same basic point in process that's so important. I illustrate these things like position and velocity and so forth, acceleration. If I put it, see, what's to your right would be to my left. We call this plus. And I let it go and it swings. goes from plus to minus, plus to minus, plus to minus. Now, if this is plus, then which way is it being pulled? To minus. See, this is the minus side. And when is the pull the maximum? See, there's no pull there. The pull is the maximum when it's here, but it's minus. And it's a maximum here, but it's plus. But where's the position of maximum? There, but it's plus. And where's the velocity of maximum? At the bottom. See, it's not going, it stops here and then it's going to maximum here. I can lay all that out on this diagram in terms of phase. If this is the position, which I call L for length because I measure it in terms of inches length, then in terms of the cycle. This is the beginning of the cycle. This is halfway through the cycle. This is quarter way through the cycle. And of course, on the way back, this is 3/4 of the way. So the position is a maximum here, that's what we'll call plus. The velocity is a maximum here, which is halfway through, or a quarter way through the cycle. And whichever, if I could think of it going back and forth or just going around, the point is it gets back to this point at the end of the cycle. So here's V plus, and here's L minus, and here's V minus. But we recall that the acceleration was negative over here, so I'll put A minus. And the acceleration was plus here, so I'll put A plus. So I could leave out the minuses and just say position maximum here, acceleration maximum at this cycle, with a velocity maximum here. So I want another term for this negative velocity. Now you wouldn't get that until I do some little more playing with it. I could let you do this yourself. You could feel it. How do I stop it? In fact, how do I make it go? If I go against the swing, I make it go faster. If I go with it, I stop it. So it enables me to say that the control is opposite the velocity. And these four are another example of the fourness. I've tried to do it just in visual terms, but the mathematical expressions would be the calculus. This is known, well, this is length, and velocity is the first derivative of length. Velocity, this is what Newton did. He said, let velocity equal, there wasn't any term like velocity. He said, but that thing we call motion, let it be length divided by time, which is what we say it goes 10 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour, or 10 feet a second. So much distance, L, per unit of time. Well, then if I said my Volkswagen can get to 60 miles an hour in 10 seconds, that would be acceleration. But notice that I say miles per hour per second. I've got time in twice. And to make that very simple, I say L over T squared. Each time I divide by time, I put in another T there. And this one is control. It's the rate of change of acceleration. See, acceleration was the rate of change of velocity. I can go to 60 miles an hour in 10 seconds. That would be different from going to 60 miles an hour in 1 second. Or if I hit a telegraph pole, I'd go to 0 miles an hour in a very small fraction of a second. That would be unbearable. So the control, the change of acceleration, when I push the accelerator or put on the brakes or even steer it, they're control. Now Newton only went this far. And I don't know whether he explored that or not, but what was picked up was with acceleration, position, and velocity, you can work all this clockwork out and figure everything. And that's all there is to it. There isn't any free will. But I say that's taking it one more step. The control function provides the freedom. You recognize position through your vision, sensation. How do you recognize velocity? Now that may be a tricky question.
Feel it? And that's acceleration.
It's acceleration you feel. Thank you. You're way ahead of me. But suppose you're in an airplane going to New York at 600 miles an hour. Do you feel the 600 miles an hour? Do you feel we're going through space at 18 miles a second? Do you feel that? How do you know that we're going through space at 18 miles a second?
You conceptualize it?
Right. You have to compute, you have to make an observation of where you were one day and then where you are the next day, or 1 minute and the next minute, divide by the time elapsed, and you get the velocity per hour or per day or per second. So you compute velocity, conceptualize, as Anne says. Now, we already, thanks to you, you feel the acceleration. That's what you feel when the elevator goes suddenly. Or infants are born with a fear of falling. It's one of the most basic fear, it is the most basic fear there is, the fear of falling. So it's felt instinctively. Feeling. Now, here I started with these mathematical, physical concepts, the concepts of physics, things that are measures for the physicist. But what am I drawing? I'm drawing the functions. Sensation, intellect, emotion, and what's this one? This is going to be the free choice one because you're there to choose where to go. They're not identical to the functions of Jung. They are the actions that are appropriate for the functions of Jung. Acceleration is the result of slowing the car down, speeding it up, or turning it. Now, Jack, for your benefit, slowing down and speeding up would be back and forth on one line, but steering it would be on the other axis, see. And that's why the force is at right angles to the acceleration. If planets going around in a circle. See, this is what Newton realized. When the moon was going around the Earth, here's the Earth and the moon, he recognized that it's actually falling toward the Earth. It's departing from the straight line. But the acceleration is at right angles to its path. You see, if the moon were facing this way instead of this way, then it would go right into the Earth. But here it's still accelerating toward the Earth, but it's going in a different direction. Now, I have this built into the text in a rather neat way. People don't notice it, but I talk about angular momentum in the atom being the saving feature. If the electron doesn't have this going around us, it has no freedom to choose. It's caught by the attraction of the the positive charge in the center. It just swings back and forth forever. This way it can cruise around and get away. That is built into the physics. Only by virtue of the angular momentum can the atom change state. Now, if it if this was, instead of being the moon going around the Earth, is the electron going around the atom, if it has this angular momentum, this circular movement, see, which is a movement this way as against this way, it's like your ability to, well, suppose you were hooked on drugs, shall we say, or liquor. You might be very much attracted and then get a hangover and be very much repelled. And that's what the thing would have to do. It oscillates back and forth between these conditions. Neither one is the way out. You have to get to the capacity to move independently of the attraction, not toward it or away from it. That's the basis of your freedom, and it's the basis of the electron's freedom to escape to a higher state. Angular momentum is what the photon, I could say, is rather than has. This going aroundness. Remember, the photon, the light spark right at the beginning, is the thing that makes everything there is happen. Just not only the interchange between particles, but the creation of the particles themselves. For moreover, as light, it's the aha experience, so it's the virgin birth too. So it's very important to know what it is. And there I run into the risk of some formulas, but I'm going to just override any damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. I'll just give you this formula because, and it's not all that bad. People talk about energy. I want to share my energy, or I'm feeling, or something, or spiritual energy. It isn't really energy, I think, that counts. It's the, you might say it, a relative of energy, but in any case it's action. I think I did say that Planck's discovery at the beginning of the century was that radiation came in quanta, these jumps, lumps, and they're units of angular momentum. Well, what's angular momentum? Momentum is that which a moving body has. I mean, the momentum would break the glass. It causes things to happen in this linear way. A car hits a telegraph pole and kills all the passengers. But when the momentum of the telegraph pole or the tree, that's not quite right. The momentum of the car hitting the tree depends on the velocity. The faster it is, and it also depends on the mass. So if you were going to transfer energy by that method, you'd have to depend on variable speed. Bullets, for instance. But light, this photon, does it in varying amounts, but always at the same speed. So you can't make the momentum of the light depend on the speed. This ordinary linear momentum does, because it's mass times velocity. The light momentum is of a different nature. It's angular momentum, which is ml squared over t. It's the same as this, except multiplied by L. That's equal to mv times L. What is this other L? It's the radius of this circle. Remember I said the moon going around the Earth? Well, that radius is this L. It's as though you took this momentum and put it in a box, and then you could handle this box irrespective of the velocity. You could just pass it around. It doesn't depend on its viciousness. It's just there as a sort of present in the box for you to take out at your leisure. That is the thing that makes things alive. That is the thing that makes things choose. And it can be very minute, as the quantum of action is, but it can control. And the reason it can control is because it's going around and has choice of that direction. Is there any confusion about what I've got here? M means mass. That's, everybody knows mass. That's what you, the mass you have. Length is inches, feet, whatever. Time is what? Those are the three basic parameters of physics: mass, length, and time. And it's presumed there is no other. And I'm perfectly willing to say there is no other too. But I still wasn't happy with it because I wanted four. You know my predilection for fourness. Well, there ought to be a four. And it was the the myth of Osiris that tipped me off. What is lost when Osiris is chopped up into pieces?
Creative principle.
Creative principle. The creative principle comes out of wholeness. And the wholeness is this formula. And I do it that way because I like to call it the cosmic goose egg.
You mean the yolk's on us?
Well, you know, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. The egg broke. And when you break the cosmic goose egg, I'll put the formula back. How can you break it? One way is to break it into those two things that Heisenberg dealt with, position and momentum. That would be ML, ML over T is momentum, and the other L is the position. See, if I multiply those, I get those. Another way to break it, how can I indicate it? Off here is energy times time. Now, I'd have to do a little figuring to show you that because actually energy looks more complicated. It's mc squared. You remember Einstein thing? Well, for c squared, I put L over t because c is a velocity. So it's ml squared over t squared. And when I multiply that by t, I get rid of this square, and that's the same as this. There are others. I think about 6 different ways you can get MLT. But what's perhaps more interesting is to keep going. Suppose I take this ML squared over T squared times times T. That's energy times time. Then I take the energy and I divide it into mass times length, or mass times velocity. And then I take another generation and divide the velocity into L and T. What's happening here is from this cosmic goose egg, from this original unity, I'm getting a duality and then another breakdown, and finally the breakdown that creates the ordinary universe of mass, length, and time, measuring length in feet and time in seconds and so forth. But it was all wrapped up there in one package at the beginning. And that's the creative unity that has this potency to get something done. I want to sound off on a proper note. I want to make one final plea for action as the unitary principle that creates the universe, that maintains it, and pushes it along through this whole sweep of evolution from original life sparks to human beings, and beyond that, supermen and gods. It's the thread that strings through these beads. And if you want to think about it, don't think about the beads, think about the quantum of action going through the bead. In other words, this quantum of action takes on a particle, and then it takes on an atom, and then it takes on a molecule, and finally it takes on a human body. But it's the quantum of action that is the monad. I call it the monad after the turn, but it's the thing that's evolving, because the matter sloughs off and returns to dust.